Good morning, everyone. My name is Christoph Nedopil-Wang, and I'm the director of the Green Belt and Road Initiative at the International Institute of Green Finance in Beijing. It's a great pleasure to be here today and moderate this, I think, very, very exciting and timely panel on e-mobility and its impact on sustainability, a blessing or a curse. I'm very, very excited to have a very distinguished panelist. You all met Fang An today, a good friend, an absolute expert on e-mobility, and I think he just showed his great expertise on the topic. Next to him is Akin Adamson. He's the director of Ricardo Energy and Environment, the Middle East director. Ricardo Energy and Environment is a global strategic engineering and environmental consultancies with offices across the GCC. He has very broad experience from UK's Transport Research Laboratory to Nokia Siemens Networks, Telstra in Australia, A.T. Kearney, and so he's been around very strong expertise in telco, transport, environmental studies, waste management. And his goal is to build sustainable cities, of which e-mobility is definitely a big part. And then it's very exciting to also have Dakota Semler, CEO and co-founder of Exos Trucks, and we will have a wonderful video for him. Wow, super cool. So Dakota Semler is founded Exos Truck in 2016 together with his co-founder Gio Sordoni. He's a real self-starter, serial entrepreneur. He's developing this electric semi-truck, the ET1, or they are currently, which has the capacity to haul up to 80,000 pounds with a 300 miles range per charge, which is quite impressive. And a medium-duty electric delivery truck for a range of 200 miles. So really a super exciting panel, and I think also what's exciting to have panelists from 3 different regions of the world, so China, the Middle East, and the US. So we already heard a little bit from Fang An about kind of the experiences in China to make e-mobility a success, or what are some of the challenges. Maybe let's move to the US directly. What do you think are the main challenges to make e-mobility indeed a blessing rather than a curse?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to start out with because there's so many regional factors that are downplayed, particularly when we come to international conferences like GITEX. In the US, the biggest hurdle that we see today is not actually the one most people are expecting, which is cost. The biggest hurdle is infrastructure. And we begin to deploy for fleets. The thing that they're looking to really overcome is chargers and how do we deploy chargers responsibly with the utility grids, and so that they don't pay an arm and a leg for them. So I'd say infrastructure is core to really being able to deploy at scale as opposed to just in a prototyping environment.
What do you think?
I'd agree with that to a certain extent. I think infrastructure is certainly a key driver to the take-up of electric vehicles. What I would say is I think here in the Middle East there's a perception around how effective electric vehicles can be in this region. We know that the electric vehicles, particularly battery technology, is adversely affected by particularly heat, but also dust and salinity. We know those are things that are very high here. So I think there's a perception that, particularly with in a vehicles drawing power, or a great deal of power for things like air conditioning, that electric vehicles perhaps are disadvantaged in this region. But I think we also forget how electric vehicles are going to be used in this region as well. I mean, a lot of these, the countries in the region, or the city-states in the region are relatively small, and that many vehicles, I believe, I assume, but I believe, are used for relatively short, small distances, and could easily be recharged on a daily basis. And it's only if you're doing very long commutes that the ability to keep a vehicle charged throughout the day becomes a problem. So I think there is a perception that the environmental conditions here are a challenge to electric vehicles. I think that's probably not as real as we might imagine.
Fangan, I have a question for you as well, which goes in a similar direction. So I also work in China for the last couple of years on transportation and sustainable transportation as one of the fields. And China has this impressive goal of bringing 480 million electric cars potentially on the road by 2050. The battery power of those electric cars are equivalent to 10 smartphones per person for the whole planet. So just to put that into perspective, what do you think are ways to make this sustainable?
I think, the scale of this, battery demand hasn't reached. But I think China has a strategy, for the recycling, battery recycling. So they believe, a lot of, the rare earth material like the precious metal can be recovered by recycling the batteries. And I think it's very important for the battery recycling. I think it's a huge, very critical, important industry. I think a lot of companies, not just in China, also in Silicon Valley, they have started to plan, the future in China. One, the massive, retirement of a wave of the battery, also the, I think that take place. Also, China has a huge, like ATL, is the biggest battery makers in the world. So I think it's a big challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a two-part question, I'd say. When you talk about sustainability of electric vehicles, there's the sustainability and the scrappage or the recycling of those systems after their end of their useful life. But there's also the energy that's going into those vehicles and charging them. And from a battery recycling perspective, I think as a globally, not just China or the US, we have a lot of work to do to find better solutions and build a better supply chain out that can recycle these battery systems at scale. The closest parallel is the consumer electronics industry, and the recycling that's been done there hasn't really been scaled up to what we would need for electric vehicles. On the energy generation side, I think we're actually well along the way to building a sustainable infrastructure system that supports EVs. We like to think about EVs a little differently. Most people compare EVs to diesel or to compressed natural gas as a technology. It's really a means of storing energy. So when you talk about your generation source, you can have an electric vehicle and still have a grid that runs on natural gas or solar or hydroelectric power and still be able to build a sustainable infrastructure system, but your end storage technology is an electric vehicle using batteries. I think that segment of the industry, both here in the Gulf with a lot of kind of innovative solar projects, but also globally in China and in the US, there's a lot of work being done to implement various types of renewables across the grid.
Staying with kind of this part of the value chain on the energy input, maybe you can add some of the experience from the Middle East. Kind of what is the role of the energy supply, and kind of what is the strategies of the energy supply to make it more sustainable also for, as you mentioned, the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, but also in the generation of the electricity?
Yeah, well, I guess if you take a bigger look even outside of this region, I mean, it's common knowledge that probably the country in the world that is leading the electric vehicle transition is Norway. I think roughly 40 to 50% of new vehicle purchases now are electric vehicles in Norway. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Norway has one of the highest renewable sources of electricity generation through hydro, plus a little bit of nuclear as well. So I think that the two are very linked. Of course, in this region, fuel or petrol or diesel, gasoline has traditionally been very cheap. So that's not been a driver towards alternative fuels. But we also know that energy generation is also relatively low cost as well, particularly with natural gas. So with very high levels of energy generation, the generating capacity and the cost of generation here is certainly not a limiting factor for electric vehicle rollout. I think probably what we're seeing is the biggest hurdle to overcome is actually the charging networks here, as it is perhaps all over the world, and how you can put the right sorts of chargers in the right sorts of places to give people the confidence that they have today in the sort of petrol station network, that wherever they're going to be with their electric vehicle, they're always going to be within an acceptable kind of distance from the charging infrastructure that means their vehicle is usable 100% of the time.
Yeah, I have make one point. I think one critical strategy to manage the energy demand is to use the off-peak charging. I think especially like in China, for example, there's a curtailment for wind power, which is during the night have a biggest power generation capability, but it cannot be used. So it's a lot more waste of the renewable energy. So use that energy. Use battery as a storage. So if you can charge the battery EV load during the off-peak hours, so that instead of try to charging during the peaking hours, so that's make huge difference. So how to manage the energy demand by electric vehicle is also very critical. Yeah.
I think that's a huge opportunity to kind of really even out the energy supply and demand, actually to use also the electric storage capacities of electric vehicles. But it seems it's not being successful, even in China. People just want to charge their cars when they plug it in. It's not that they're really willing to say, okay, I'm going to wait whenever the system decides that I can charge. So the question is a little bit on all different fronts. The energy supply, the infrastructure, also and the behavior. What is the role of policy to really implement that? What is the role of policymakers to force people or not force people to charge at specific times, in building infrastructure and in providing incentives or non-incentives for sustainable energy? And it's really interesting that we have these three very different regions here. China more centrally planned. Here, I think also a lot of government money, and the American very market-driven form of the economy. So maybe you can give us some ideas what you think should be the role of policy in the life cycle and energy supply of the electric vehicles, and to make it also sustainable.
Yeah, I can go from the US's perspective. I think we've benefited from policymakers having a hand in deployment of electric vehicles. We've used a little bit more of the carrot incentive than the stick, and there's a lot of incentives around fleet electrification and even passenger car electrification. But I'd say that there's not enough work has been done on behalf of policymakers to continue to kind of spark change. When we look at the space, right now they've influenced mostly the purchase or the acquisition of electric vehicles, not necessarily the progressive deployment of charging infrastructure. So when you start to think about policymakers having a hand in infrastructure deployment, it becomes a lot more complicated. The US is not known for being centrally governed, but when it comes to the utilities, it's even less so. So you'll have regional utilities that'll be regulated by regional and local governments, which also have oversight from some federal regulatory bodies, which are sometimes state-owned enterprises, and sometimes they're investor-owned utilities. So there's this immensely complex web that's really leading infrastructure deployment to, I think, stagnate a little bit. When we look at it from the fleet's perspective, it's an optimal use case. Because if you think about a passenger car, you want to be able to drive your car wherever, whenever, however. But fleets, and particularly the fleets we're selling to, are generally driving under 150 miles a day. They're returning to the same base of operations so they can deploy infrastructure at that location. And they're delivering during business hours. So they can charge during those off-peak times where wind generation or other forms of generation are usually generating in surplus.
Yeah, I think in this region there's probably three dynamics to consider. One is the actual shift in vehicle type. We're moving from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles that I think will almost certainly require government legislation to push that transition, because without it, conventional vehicles will just have a cost premium, both in terms of the purchase cost and the running cost. So, and I think probably the stick will be the thing that will need to drive that transition. So increasing taxation on conventional vehicles. That's the first dynamic. I think the second dynamic around charging infrastructure is probably a mixture of public and private. So particularly in this region, you have lots and lots of new developments, lots and lots of new construction of infrastructure. That infrastructure, if we want to encourage electric vehicles, should include electric charging infrastructure as part of those developments. Now, of course, developers don't do anything unless either there's profit in them for it or they're mandated to do it. So I suspect that there will be a role for government in mandating that new developments or new infrastructure needs to include a level of charging infrastructure such that electric vehicles can be properly enabled across the region. And I think the third dynamic is probably the market one. And we've already heard a number of examples where the price of electricity can determine people's propensity to charge their vehicle or not. So, with smart charging systems or smart grids, yes, you can come in the afternoon after you finish work, plug in your vehicle, and if you're prepared to pay to have that charged immediately, maybe you're charged a certain amount of money. But if you're happy to let the electricity provider decide when your vehicle is charged, let's say over the next 12 hours, overnight, then maybe you'll be charged a smaller amount. And I think the market will also determine, how electricity is used to charge these vehicles, whether they're in the public domain or in private control.
Yeah, I think government play a very, very important role. I think first is through the subsidies, carrots. Right now, they're increasingly depends on the state mandate. And I think Chinese government has the mandate for every automakers to sell vehicle has to meet. I think by 2020 it's going to be 14% ZEV credit. I think the one policy we have introduced from California to China is called ZEV, zero emission vehicle credit tradings, because the government set the target for 15%, and 20%. So if the government cannot reach that target of new energy vehicle, they have to sell. They have to buy credit from the company who exceed that credit. That's how Tesla made a lot of money by selling the zero emission vehicle credit. So we introduced that policy to China. China used that policy to replace the subsidies for the EVs. So I think that's why the policy really play very important role, especially on the initial stage of the of the market development. Of course, eventually has to turn to a market. The market has to sort out the winners and the losers. Yeah.
I think the whole policy issue is a super, super complicated one. I mean, right now we just touched one part of it. We didn't touch the R&D part of it, and we didn't touch kind of the recycling and after services part of it. So I think we could go much deeper into the whole policy question, because I think it's a super crucial one. We have to kind of set the framework, the policy framework, for it to make it successful. But I want to switch a little bit to a different angle and aspect of it, partnerships. Also kind of very interesting that we have in every country we have now, or every major region, we have a handful of players or 4,000 players in China that really kind of try to drive electric mobility. And I want to give you a quote from Dakota, which he had in a newspaper. He said, "No one can get fully electric commercial vehicles on the road by themselves. This industry is so capital intensive and it has so many moving parts that if we really want to get these vehicles on the road today and not 10 years from now, we need to throw out the playbook." So what is the role of particularly international partnerships and to make e-vehicles successful? What is your opinion? Maybe Feng'an, you start.
I think there's a lot of, I think China has shown that it's possible to make a massive EV production and sales. I think the multinational like European automakers, initially they are very reluctant to embrace this all electric strategy. Now the major like BMW and Mercedes, so they all kind of buy in, and like I said, I showed the European countries are take a lead actually to ban the internal combustion engine vehicles one way or another. So I think there's a strong kind of a partnership. I think but of course U.S. is a different story, because the current because the U.S. and China was on a path to collaborate on a lot of things, like climate change and the clean energy and the electric vehicle. But now it's kind of try to decouple. So it's hard to say what's the U.S. and China, play out relationship. But I think for the European, and China, they talk very, closely, and also Japan and Korean to kind of to promote, electrification strategy together. Yeah.
Akin, do you have any thoughts?
In terms of partnerships, I probably don't have a huge point of view, but I think one of the interesting factors around electric vehicles is that they start to encroach on other industries and other parts of the sort of supply chain and generation supply chain in particular that I don't think we fully understand yet. So, of course, if you own a conventionally powered car, the only place you can get fuel from that is from a petrol station or a gasoline station. With an electric vehicle, you have the possibility of generating the power to propel that vehicle yourself. You put some solar panels on the roof, you make use of some wind generation, and suddenly you become decoupled from the grid, if you like, in terms of generating that power. And then once you're generating your own power, let's say for an electric vehicle, which we know is a kind of a particular use case, then of course you've got power for lots of other different use cases as well. And I think one of the things that we'll see over the next 10 years as people adopt electric vehicles is also the sort of privatization of the generation grid, if you like, and then how that enables the way that we generate and use electricity as individuals. And I think in 10 years' time, that landscape will, I'm sure, look very different from what it is today.
Very interesting.
Yeah, as you know, I'm very big on partnering. When it comes to the supply chain of the vehicles, I think commercial vehicles are so locally driven. You can't go into a market and successfully achieve adoption and scale and growth without understanding local dynamics, whether that's local business, regulations, economic factors. So as we scale into other markets, it's always through channel partners, other OEMs, other supply chain partners that we can leverage their learning and their expertise in that local market. But going back to Akin's point, I think there are all sorts of industries, businesses that are going to be impacted by the introduction of both commercial and passenger electric vehicles. And we've started to see this take hold with some of the largest petrol companies in the world, like Shell, making investments in energy management technologies and EV companies, and really wanting to be a part of that value chain long term. And I think as that happens, the potential for EVs really, really scales. Because not only do you have the input, the perspective, the market knowledge that these entrenched partners provide, but in a very capital-intensive industry, you also have the financial capabilities that they provide and can help scale across regions.
Yeah, I think partnerships seems to be extremely important. I mean, there's a lot of sustainability along the supply chain that kind of only can be really achieved with partnerships, global partnerships. Standards is something which is done through partnerships. Capital intensive industries kind of need partnerships. So I think there's a lot of roles for partnerships, and I hope that the world allows us to do that, trade war being aside. Looking at the time, I want to ask one final question, and I want us to think about the year 2029. So 10 years from now, what do you think we wish we would have decided today in the year 2019 differently to make electric mobility sustainable?
It's real simple for me. No trade war. Let's just avoid that altogether. Really, though, I think it's, in order to progress change and to scale, I think we need collaboration on a global scale. And whether the trade war is between China and the US or other nations, it's just counterproductive. And so reducing those barriers that inhibit, trade and cross-border trade and collaboration on innovation is, I think, the biggest thing we need to focus on now, and we'll wish in 2029 that we didn't have to deal with.
Akin.
I would say there's probably two things that I would ask the industry as a whole to focus on. I think we certainly don't want to slow down the progression to electric vehicles, but I think in 10 years' time, if we're not careful, we could be looking back and saying, I wish we'd focused on these two things. One is, as we've touched on already, is recycling. to make sure that the things we're making today are recyclable and that we don't lumber ourselves with a huge problem in 10 years' time of fairly kind of toxic and obnoxious chemicals, compounds, or products that we struggle to deal with. That's the first thing. And the second one is, we know already that there are some ethical issues with some of the commodities or raw materials required, particularly for battery production, that some of those commodities or those raw materials are coming from places that are untraceable, and we know that people being used to mine or produce those materials may not be treated in a way that we'd like them to be treated. And in 10 years' time, do we want to look back and say, actually, we missed a trick by not regulating perhaps one of the earlier steps in the supply chain to make sure that the whole industry is not just efficient and sustainable, but is also ethical as well?
Yeah, I think we are living in the era of accelerated technology breakthrough. I think 10 years, from today, maybe we may be under predict a lot of technological changes. It's, the electrify the powertrain is only a small part of the whole mobility revolution. So I think 10 years from today, you will see massive autonomous vehicle and the shared mobility, different smart city. I think we always underestimate technology breakthrough in the longer time frame, and try to over predict is very short. So I think 10 years back, we will see today. I think we maybe forget a lot of major, missed a lot of major technology breakthroughs, from now on. Yeah.
Okay, I think time is really short, especially when you have such a wonderful panel, such interesting discussion. So I really want to thank the panelists for their insights, and I hope the audience also took away some new learnings about electric mobility, international collaboration or non-collaboration, and the challenges and how to make it sustainable. So with that, thank you very much, and I think the panelists will be around for further questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Well done, guys. That was awesome. Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm sure you enjoyed that as much as I did. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the morning as much as I have. We're going to take a quick break now for 10 minutes before we recontinue the conversation. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.